if you want to be really a great economist, you have to have an interest in how actually economic policy is made, and it's how it is prosecuted. Because sometimes it seems to me that methodology that is used by economics is inappropriately applied to the issues where actually much more historical study would make more sense. So even if economists were to come up with one solution, when I say one solution, I mean that even if there is no disagreement among the economists, I think it would still need a political decision. I have the argument that capitalism is now at the, if you will, apogee of its influence. Now we don't know if this is going to be global maximum, so it would go down from that point, or it's a local maximum and it can again go even higher. So we really have two opposite dangers. One danger is to imagine worlds of utopia which are unrealizable, or the other extreme is to believe that whatever now exists by the virtue of existence confirms that it's the only possible way of life. And I think both of these are wrong for opposite reasons, which means that we have to accept life as it is, but try to improve it. Well, that's a big one. I could say why economics matters. I mean, you can maybe give two different answers. I would like to start with the one which, when one was young and actually studied Marxist economics, and I'm somewhat back to that now, I think it matters because it enables you to look at the grand political and economic changes in history and to explain them with economic factors. In other words, it is somewhat of a kind of a branch of historical materialism. In other words, economic decisions or decisions driven by economic factors shape societies and make them change. A different, more neoclassical, I think, view of economics would be more pragmatic, would be to argue that economics matters because then to use, Alfred Marshall there, because it deals with our ordinary life and its objective is to improve our ordinary life, to make our incomes higher, maybe to allow us to have more free time, or in other words, to actually make poverty disappear so that we can actually enjoy many other activities that we like while having satisfactory level of living. Well, that's maybe even more difficult. I would say that obviously economics used in academia are more abstract, and very often they are driven by internal requirements of academic promotion, or what is the most interesting topic at the time, or maybe most difficult topic at the time, let's suppose mathematically or otherwise, that you want to solve. Whereas economics that are used in policy are driven, which is I think somewhat trivial to say, but driven by everyday problems of policymaking. But let me just say here that I believe that no great economist was dividing these two very sharply. In other words, if you look at history of all great economists, and I will start with Quesnay. Actually, I'm writing now about Quesnay himself. Obviously, he did the, Le Grand Tableau Économique and everything else. He did because he was interested in policy. He was interested in influencing French economic policy very concretely. what better example than to take of Adam Smith or David Ricardo, which were clearly interested in policy. I mean, for Ricardo, that's obvious that he wrote the entire book, which became Principles because of the Corn Laws. And Marx as well was interested in policy, not necessarily to improve policy, but to see actually how economics would tell us which way the capitalist society would go. The same is true for Keynes. Unnecessary even to mention that, because Keynes was in and out of policy making throughout his life. And even others, for example, Milton Friedman was very much interested in policy. Whether one likes what he did, for example, in Chile or doesn't, that's irrelevant for this point, because he was clearly interested in policy. So I don't think that really in real life we have really to make such a big distinction. And I think that if you want to be really a great economist, you have to have an interest in how actually economic policy is made, and it's how it is prosecuted. Well, I think it plays an increasing role in society. I think that because societies have become very capitalistic, and one thing that I would like to emphasize always, they have become much more numerous than they used to be. Economics, after all, deals with quantities, and these quantities, of course, are expressed either in more abstract ways as formulas, but they're also expressed as numbers. And if you compare the numeracy of modern societies, it is much greater than the numeracy of the less developed societies. Even nowadays, if you compare, for example, very capitalistic countries like the United States or Western Europe and so on, with much less developed countries in Africa, I mean, people are just much more numerous now in the rich countries. And being numerate is, I think, one of the prerequisites of understanding economics. So I think economics does play an increasing role. Of course, as you know, some people even accuse economics of its economic imperialism, whereby its methodology, or its methods rather, are being applied in other sciences, most obviously in political science, human sociology, and so forth. So I think it does play a big role. At times, I have to say, I think actually it might play too big of a role, because sometimes it seems to me that methodology that is used by economics is inappropriately applied to the issues where actually much more historical study would make more sense. But to answer your question very clearly, yes, I think it plays a big role in today's life. You know, I think it's difficult for me to actually break it down into what areas economics does really very well and not among the areas that you mentioned. I actually think that economics does a fairly good job when it comes to the issue of race, inequality between genders, even climate change. That does not mean that economics alone is able to solve climate change, because we have to realize that climate change depends mostly on cooperation between governments. So even if economists were to come up with one solution, when I say one solution, I mean that even if there is no disagreement among the economists, I think it would still need a political decision. So it does not seem to me that it is, how should I say, very good in some areas and bad in others. I do have a particular quibble with the neoclassical approach to inequality in the last 50 years, before inequality became a big topic, because I think that it was undeservedly left aside, and there were some ideological reasons built both in the form that the economics has been studied and in the political reality, which actually left inequality studies out in the cold. But I would just go over each of these topics that you have mentioned, and I think actually that we would find in some of them the economics playing more of a role, in others somewhat less. But it cannot really play that role alone without support from politicians and politics. I think they become accountable for the advice once they're in politics. Like, for example, Mario Draghi is today accountable, and he was accountable when he was in ECB. But when he was a professor, I think it's more difficult to hold people accountable because they can, first, they can make mistakes. Secondly, even if they do make mistakes, it is not really their direct responsibility because it's somebody else is making the decision to follow that particular route. I think they're actually accountable to the extent that the others, as you know, would be very quick to point out this mistake, some of them may, with the glee possibly, but they would not actually miss out these mistakes. So I think that they are accountable, but we cannot have a tribunal where we are going to, sort of exorcise the economists who have been wrong. Well, I would define capitalism as I did in my book, Capitalism Alone, and I think it's a very simple definition, and precisely because it is succinct, I think it captures the essence of capitalism. It is a definition that Marx used, and actually Max Weber used it afterwards, and even Schumpeter, although he added a small one detail that I'll come in a minute. The definition it has three parts. The first part is that the most of production is done on privately owned means of production. The second part of the definition is that capital is hired, which I think I have to explain that it simply means that labor is hired. It simply means that labor does not play the entrepreneurial function. So it's not the workers who are like in a worker commune who decide what to produce and how to produce. They are actually hired by owners of capital. And the third part of the definition is that the coordination is decentralized. Schumpeter added also the need for the most of fixed or investments to be made by the private sector. So this is, I think, a fairly economical definition of capitalism. And if you look at many countries nowadays, they do actually feel they fulfill that definition, including China, which of course I have had arguments on that. But it does fulfill that definition as being capitalist. So this is for me what capitalism means. Now, of course, this is what it means for me, but of course, many other people have different definitions. Sometimes I believe they are too complicated and too fanciful, or maybe too remote from the reality or historical reality. So I would like to stick to this one.
Does economics explain capitalism?
Yes, I think it does. Actually, I think it does, especially if you look at the rise, which I'm very happy, rise of economic history, because economic history is essentially using economic tools to explain history and the rise of capitalism. And I think that the work which has been done in the last maybe 10 or 15 years by various economic historians, including Bob Allen, for example, then historians who had worked on slavery, then the entire set of work starting with Kenneth Pomeranz, about the great divergence, then continuing that Van Zenden, for example, Steve Broadberry as well, when the differences in income between India and China on one hand and Western Europe appeared for the first time. And of course, incredible contribution that Angus Madison has made by creating the data set that goes back to the 19th century, which is now being expanded. I think these are all essentially attempts to understand our modern civilization using quantitative methods. I would also, since I've mentioned many names, I think I should mention also Paul Barak, who worked, as you know, in the UN, and who is also one of the pioneers. Well, I'm in my book, I'm actually pretty optimistic on that. And actually, I have the argument that capitalism is now at the, if you will, apogee of its influence. Now, we don't know if this is going to be, global maximum, so it would go down from that point, or it's a local maximum and it can again go even higher. But I make this argument based on two elements. The first one is that they're geographically, as I kind of sort of mentioned or intimated in the previous answer, it is actually covering greater human, surface of the earth than ever before, especially because of China and then the fall of communism, 30 years ago. But also because it is really entering into new activities and making things that in the past were not capital become capital. You know, our cars have become now capital because we can rent them out, or we can actually drive the cars for profit. You know, our homes have become also capital. They used to be what is called personal property, which means it does not generate income, but now they actually become capital. So I think that it was something that again goes back to discussion that in the early 20th century that Rosa Luxemburg had a very big role in, when she sort of argued that capitalism, in order to expand, needed to move into non-capitalistic forms of production and basically invade them. But what I think she missed is that yes, that's not all, because you can also create, and that's again going back to Schumpeter, you can create new ways of producing things, combining the already things which exist, and creating new commodities. And in that sense, I think capitalism recently has been able to create new commodities because it has commercialized things which existed, and it has, on the other hand, created new commodities through technological change, including, for example, the fact that we can use Zoom today or any other such method. So I would say that as of now, I don't see a serious ideological contenders to capitalism. However, I want to just finish with that note. I'm very much of the sort of historical school, in the sense that I don't believe there is a natural mode of production that would exist forever in history. So I could definitely imagine the situation where capitalism, or these three types of the three elements that I mentioned before, no longer are valid, so that one of them or two of them or maybe even three of them are changed by other ways of organizing production. But as I said, I don't see it right now. That's really a difficult one. It is a difficult one because we can always imagine things to be better. But the question is, are such imaginations or utopia realizable? In other words, let me take, for example, climate change as an example where I had a disagreement with the tea growers. We can imagine a world where we are all happy with having the reasonable minimal standard of living for everybody, which is compatible with planetary boundaries. We can imagine that, and you can actually technically put that on a piece of paper and calculate that that particular world would produce sufficient amount of calories or all other energy and so forth that that human beings would be able to survive. But the question is actually, can such a world ever be brought into existence? And that's where you really encounter problems. You actually encounter problems that it would imply that many people who live now much more comfortably would have to lose 50 or 60% of their income. And you know that it's not likely, it's quite unreasonable to expect. And then you also have to admit that human condition is such that we generally tend to want more. So we will not be, or a significant percentage of us would not be just satisfied by having this quasi-substantial minimum. So yes, as I said, we can imagine situations like that, but we have to be realistic that we do not have the means, nor would it be desirable from the point of view of, let's call it, utility or utility of people or welfare of the people who are concerned to achieve that. But then I have to say that there is another danger there, is to go into the Panglossian world and to say whatever is now is actually the only possible solution and nothing can be changed. So we really have two opposite dangers. One danger is to imagine worlds of utopia which are unrealizable, or the other extreme is to believe that whatever now exists by the virtue of existence confirms that it's the only possible way of life. And I think both of these are wrong for opposite reasons, which means that we have to accept the life as it is, but try to improve it. I know that doesn't seem very sort of, grandiose. It does seem a little bit sort of limited, but I think that's the only way that the progress has been done, is actually by taking the starting point as a life as it is now, and then trying to improve wherever we can.
So it's like the politics of the small steps, I would say, yes?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Actually, William mentioned that at the end too. Yes, it is a pragmatic policy of small steps. But personally, one thing that I really would like to avoid is, first, on the last question, I think definitely to avoid even grandiose utopias, or to avoid also a belief which is common among people that we have a natural system where actually nothing practically can be improved. So yes, it is a policy of small steps, but I think being aware that capitalism is a system that might not last forever, even if we do not have a blueprint. In my opinion, we do not have a blueprint in front of us that would change it. I also think that basically having a blueprint is even a wrong idea, because if you look in the past, and when you look how different systems have changed, that sounds pretty Marxist, but I think it's true. They have changed because they have gradually become more efficient, and they have replaced the other system through the kind of greater efficiency and the desire of people to accept such systems. In other words, it is, I think, very clear that serfdom was, in terms of output and production of output, less efficient than free labor being hired by capital. So it could happen, and I'm not kind of dismissing that, it could happen that actually some changes in the relative power or relative abundance of the factors of production make certain features of capitalism sort of go away. Let me just give an example. If you have a significant increase for like half a century or maybe a century of capital, on the other hand, with the plateauing of the global population at 10 or 11 billion people, you would certainly have a change in the relative abundance or scarcity of capital and labor. So it could be that actually, like what we do nowadays with startups, that individuals themselves essentially put together a plan, they borrow the money, and the entrepreneurial function belongs to labor. So that could be one way that actually capitalism could be changed. So I'm not, as I said, ruling that. So I'm not actually against sort of thinking ahead. I'm just very careful, I think, at the current time, and when I say current time, I'm meaning like 10 to 15 years, of not really jumping to some big blueprints, especially when it comes to degrowth. Actually, that was one of my peeves here.
Great. Maybe one just follow-up question from me. In response to COVID, there's obviously been a lot of ideas on how we transform the system and the lessons we learn. And, always, it's not very pragmatic in the sense that we want to transform systems, but there's often a lot less emphasis on how we actually could pay for this, or what are the implications in terms of how states can raise revenues. And do you have any kind of ideas in this arena? Because, many would argue that we need a more progressive tax and benefit system to address things like inequalities. But do you have some thinking in this area that could be useful?
I actually think that as of now, and of course, as you know, unfortunately, this is not over yet. And to some extent, it seems to me that the virus is almost playing a game with us, because whenever we had the feeling that we are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, something else has happened that actually pushed us back. So, but I think so far, to me, there are several lessons that I think we have learned. One is the need for much greater state role, particularly when it comes to health prevention on infectious diseases and other things, which were quite known in the past. So it is not new, but it has just been essentially forgotten. Also, the need, obviously, for many countries to have a control over the production of the essential goods that are needed in the case of epidemics. The second thing, which I think is going to stay with us, is that we have realized that many of the jobs can be done remotely, and that would have an implication for the global labor market, because it would act to some extent in some professions, it would really start mimicking the global labor market even without physical migration. So I think this is a big, change, because you would actually have people living in countries where the price level is lower and wages are lower, but they will be able to do the same job that people in France or the US or England are able to do, which I think leads to an interesting sort of a situation, that you would actually have an employer hiring somebody not for $50 in the US or the Western Europe, by hiring somebody for 20 in a much poorer country. But in that much poorer country, with the price level maybe being so low, much lower, the 20 would actually mean more than 50 in real terms. So you would have a very bizarre situation, that it would be a much cheaper worker, but the standard of living of that worker would be higher than the standard of living of the equivalent worker in the West, had the equivalent worker been hired. So I think it's an interesting issue from the welfare point of view, because the price differentials really play a big role there. And this is absolutely new. We didn't have that case in the past. So this, I think, will be another new element brought in by the pandemic. Finally, I have to say that in my Capitalism Alone, I took relatively dim view of the UBI. And I still stand by the objections or the problems that I identified there. But I have to admit that if the UBI had been in existence during the pandemic, it would have smoothened the things significantly, because you would not need to go through all the basically political decision making, bring it to the parliament or the Congress to distribute really massive amounts of money in support. UBI would have done that automatically. So this is, for me, one area where I've somewhat changed my opinion. Now, of course, I do hope that we will not have emergencies like that, like every 5 years. So, no, if we happen to have them once a century, still the arguments against the UBI, in my opinion, would remain strong. Nevertheless, I have modified my opinion on that.